Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which has many things going on, wrapped in a pandemic, overheating, turbulent right now. Not just because it's hurricane season, but because the amplification effect of global warming is already measurably intensifying some aspects of storms that we would already have expected to happen this time of year. And we've just survived in the United States a cross country calamity that started in the Gulf and has spread through the Northeast, leaving dozens more deaths here than even have been counted so far down where the storm Hurricane Ida first hit at Category 4.
Oh,
And it felt like a great time to connect with Andrew Kruczkiewicz, who's a climate scientist working at the interface of climate and communities around the world, from Rohingya refugee camps to parts of Africa to here in New York City, through Columbia Climate School and the IRI. I'm not going to get into the long name for IRA. If you Google for Columbia and IRI and climate, you'll find a lot of stuff. And Andrew, you're also in a zone that was struck. You're
yes,
in the Gowanus part of Brooklyn, right?
correct.
So the a lot of scientists deal in abstractions, and here you are immersed in it. Can you just give us a thumbnail sketch of where you are right now and how
Yes.
things are going, and then we'll get into the details.
Yes, thanks for asking about that, Andy, and thanks for the opportunity to share some additional thoughts of this monumental event. Is really what it is, especially when we look at the impact and who experienced the majority of the impact. I think this is a moment for us to reflect in a similar way that Sandy was a moment that we had a responsibility to reflect on many things. So yeah, I'm in Gowanus, Brooklyn, and for those who know Gowanus, it's kind of at the base of three hills. So you have like Park Slope on the one side, you have Borum Hill to the north, and then you have Cobble Hill, Carroll Gardens, also like a hill. So everything kind of funnels down here. And I mean, it's not a new thing. I mean, people know that, I mean, we have the canal here. The canal is susceptible to a certain type of flooding. During Sandy, there was storm surge flooding came up through the canal. But the flooding yesterday was different, a different type of flooding, and definitely the topography of the area amplified the flooding in my neighborhood here. And yeah, it was a stressful scene a couple nights ago. And I think in the neighborhood there was approximately 20 to 25 cars floating. Some basement apartments were flooded. There were not any casualties in this neighborhood, thankfully, but that was not the case in many parts of New York City and then also in the region. But yeah, so now the neighborhood, I mean, people are cleaning up. I mean, it was definitely a shock yesterday. We had such a beautiful day weather-wise yesterday. And I think, unfortunately, that has led to not only that, but also the distribution of the impact has led for many to kind of perhaps even forget that, or not be aware, or conveniently ignore that this event was so severe. Yeah, I was thinking about similarities to Sandy, especially in what the days after Sandy looked like versus the days after this storm. And I tend to think one of the major factors in influencing the way that we are kind of existing 2 days after this event versus Sandy is that, I mean, Wall Street really wasn't impacted this time around. I remember during Sandy, it was a big thing. A lot major companies, and essentially, yeah, Lower Manhattan was shut down. And
Right.
that's not the case here. And many people, especially the wealthier people, are moving on like really nothing happened.
Yeah, and one of the things that's most striking, one of the statistics that's most striking, is we have more than 40 deaths here. I think the majority are from basement flooding. There were some in cars too. I think the big pulse was in people driving into flooded roads, which is a long-standing thing you don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the basement flooding is so interesting to me. We'll get into that in a minute. What I'd like to do is sequence this,
Mm-hmm.
go back to the forecast,
Yes.
and then get back to your neighborhood and
Mm-hmm.
New York City and the lessons learned there. I want to show on Twitter as early as Monday, there were meteorologists warning that this is not over after the storm made landfall. We all know that Gulf storms don't just vanish when they come ashore. But there really were forecasts of significant rainfall potential and even record. Tom Berg and others, and this got reflected in forecasts, but it doesn't seem to have translated down to the level of community response, like where there are people who are living in basements, or the message didn't seem to get through. What about that drives you crazy? Your job, much of your job is about, whether it's Bangladesh cyclones or here, is about making information matter.
Yes.
In time to make a difference. And by the way, for those who are hearing a whining sound, we're having some construction on our house, not related to the hurricane, but I'll be muting in between. So anyway, what's your, what?
Yes.
How does this feel? And then, what can be done better?
Well, I think that there are differences in interpretation of if the forecast was, let's say, sufficient, or a good forecast or an appropriate forecast. And there's a lot of discussion from forecasters along the lines of, we did a good job. And not only did we do a good job forecasting this event, we also did what we were supposed to do in terms of developing and disseminating warnings. A few days before, there were different types of flood watches posted for our region and for New York City. And then as we got closer to the impact from the flash floods, flash flood warnings were issued. And then after that, flash flood emergency was issued, which is kind of all in terms of sequencing from watch, which is like a ready. The warnings is kind of a set go, also a go, but then emergency is like definitely do something about it. If you think about like the protocol, it was followed. Now, was that sufficient, right? Is that enough? And what does enough mean? Just because 90%, I'm not saying this is the case, but even if 90% of New Yorkers, 95% of New Yorkers received those warnings, perceived the risk, and then acted, is that still enough? Most of the injuries and the unfortunate should have been avoided deaths are in the very highest tier of vulnerability of all people in New York. So I think that's where we need to do better. Even if we say these protocols are sufficient to whom? Are we really addressing the people who are disproportionately impacted by disasters every time? Like, this is the same old story. And it's not good enough just to have like a quality system or protocols for flash flood warnings or any sorts of warnings. We need to make sure that these are relevant and actionable for the most vulnerable people. And that is the most frustrating part to me. And it should be for everybody. It should be the part that outrages everybody. It's not just about we need a better forecast. The forecast, of course, we could always use a better forecast, but we need to prioritize making progress at that interface with the most vulnerable populations. Oh, I think you're on mute, Andy.
Sorry, I was muting for that whining drill. I've done several sessions on here earlier about how we sometimes mix up like climate change with climate vulnerability. And the vulnerability component is so important to, in many circumstances, determining who dies or who's really most affected. The long shadow of a flood in Hurricane Harvey, poor people who were living in rented spaces who didn't have insurance will have a much longer effect of being dislocated or damaged in that flood than folks who lived in a house that got flooded and had insurance, for example. So those things just are not factored in very well. I noticed just today the EPA came out with a new report on disproportionate impacts of climate change on socially vulnerable populations. So it seems that this is starting to spread. Has it felt to you, having dealt with that vulnerability component in the foreground, like this is late in coming or finally coming? What does it feel like?
Well, it's nice to. It's important to raise awareness. I think of the disproportionate impacts. That is one step. That is one step in allocating the appropriate level of resources to understand kind of why, and then also what could be done. And if this is a step in the right direction, then I support it. This report will not help in the short term, right? There are many steps that need to happen, and that's okay. I mean, I'm not going to say the report doesn't have its place, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I have not read this report. I did see it come out, but I haven't read it yet. But yeah, I think it's good to raise awareness. I think it's good to advocate. I think, I hope it's valuable. I guess I'm assuming that it's going to be valuable, but again, I haven't read it yet. But yeah, I think we need to. There has been, I will say, at least from the disaster risk community in the past couple of years, definitely an increase in discussion around disproportionality of impact. How does that factor in our models? How does that factor in even the quantitative side of understanding risk? There's also biases that are inherent within just collecting data in terms of weather observations too, that do trickle down to influence the skill of forecasts and the way that forecasts are issued and the way that we kind of understand the degree to which an event might be extreme or just a little bit outside of the normal. Like there's a lot of other elements that go into understanding disaster risk and the disproportionality of impact. So I have seen an increase, which is great, which is really encouraging. But still, there are ways to go. So I think that we shouldn't mix that up. Like it's good to make progress, but yeah, what the bottom line is, it's New York City and it's 2021, and we should not have people dying in basement apartments. We went through that with Sandy. It's a very similar situation where most of the fatalities in the Rockaways, many of them, I don't know about most, many of them were also in basements. Like we learned the lesson there.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. And some of this gets to this layered problem, the layer problem. We've heard about compound risk, right? You've got COVID-19 and climate at the same time, but there are also compound drivers. Like in the city, you have a housing shortage.
Mm-hmm.
And that means there was a lot of pressure to expand housing options, including social activism groups were pushing for this. And I'm just the Pratt Center has this really interesting presentation I was exploring on this issue of making the most of the space. It has lines about egress. In other words, how do you make sure you expand access to underground habitation safely? But there was an envisioning of this being a very big and growing area, a way to sort of fill the gap.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a compound thing. You've got the pressure for housing, you have untapped space. Here you have some projections of what this might look like going forward. So I guess one of the things we'd want to be sure of is if we're going to have more basement apartments, they better damn well come with the equivalent of a smoke alarm for flood. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it's fair to say if that's something that would actually encourage people to leave. I think it's very easy to say now, like, oh, what would have helped? Some sort of fire alarm system that could have. Like, I think it's a privileged statement, and I think it's a question we could ask. Would that sort of advice have worked? And then we need to make sure we're asking the right people if it would have made a difference. Someone asked me about the storm, and they were like, "Oh, like shouldn't we have named the storm? Was that an element of confusion that led for people to be to not act?" And on one hand, it could have been right. Like something that happens after storms like this is that there's a lot of discussion of what we could have done, a lot of pressure to talk about what we should have done, what we could have done, and what we should have done, and that is very uncomfortable for me because it's easy for us to be like, oh well, you know what, I think we should have done this, and I think it's okay to kind of come up with ideas, but these should be questions. They shouldn't be statements. even on WNYC today, the mayor was talking today. It's just like, we don't know what would have helped. Even if we had a city-wide alert system, would that actually have made a difference? I don't know. I'm definitely not confident enough to say so.
Right. So, and that leads to the importance of more research, but very active sort of research where you're learning and doing and adjusting at the same time, given the urgency factor.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is an important point, though, too. It's like, yeah, we need to do research, but we also need to take action. So where's the compromise? You don't want to use this is also one of my experience from working internationally. It's very uncomfortable sometimes because you want to test out new methods, new innovative approaches to disaster risk. But it's, again, a very privileged position to be in, to even be able to consider like testing things out, especially in terms of disasters. I don't know the answer. I think it's something that we should normalize in the discussion of better preparing for disasters. Like, that element is sometimes, I think, kind of ignored or deprioritized. And I think we need to talk about it. But yeah, who makes the call? Who makes the call in identifying which approaches need to be tested and which maybe shouldn't be tested? I don't know. I don't think the scientist has the full right and agency to say that.
No, for sure. And journalists even less so. In fact, that's led me more and more to a sort of an engagement model of journalism where you're doing a lot of listening and words can be misused and misunderstood without sort of understanding who you're talking to, and in your case, understanding what needs to change. So I hope that a lot more people are taking this opportunity to think through some of the points you've just raised. I want to show something that I think illustrates another point that might be useful, especially given your experience in developing countries. Here we go. It's going to take a second. Someone a little while ago posted this video from Mexico of a flood protection barrier that's more normalized than sandbags, for example. And it struck me as quite interesting, and it reminded me of discussions I've had with, for example, Salim Haq, who represents an international effort at climate adaptation and resilience. In those conversations I've had with him, he said, we both kind of concluded there's a lot that the South can teach the North here about ways to be more responsive. And obviously not everything can be transferred magically, as you just said, but how many of these lessons have already been learned elsewhere that we might be thinking about here?
I think, so I'm watching this, I have not seen this video you're showing, but yeah, I mean, who are the right people to discuss, I guess, if this is worth, what I'm thinking is, could this work in some places? Yes, it could potentially work in some places. Would this work in all places in New York City, for example? Probably not. But should we consider it? I think I'm interested in what degree, what magnitude of flooding that this could actually protect from. And anyways, but that's just from watching the video. So, okay, you asked about what can we learn from
South to North. Yeah.
South to North. Well, I think something that I could speak from my experience. So when we were able to travel before COVID, I was doing a lot of work internationally, and I personally learned a lot from my experience in Mongolia, working with the Mongolian Red Cross and Mongolian government, and also the International Red Cross, in designing anticipatory action systems for Zud. Zud is a very cold drought type of event that happens, well, now more frequently happens in Mongolia, and the major impact is livestock are weakened or killed. But I learned a lot from my experience there, and it was a combination of things. But something I would like to highlight that I've learned from them and trying to incorporate into other places is their relationship with uncertainty, and kind of the way to kind of embrace that instead of ignoring that it's part of, it's an important part of managing climate and also adapting to climate change. So that's less, let's say, an innovation from an engineering perspective, but I think it's equally, if not more important to understand, yeah, these are some of the drawings. equally, if not more important, in terms of how do we understand and process risk? How do we kind of, maybe embrace isn't the right word, but acknowledge that uncertainty is not a bad word. Uncertainty is something that allows us to have forecasts in the first place. By definition, are elements of uncertainty within our forecast. So we need to figure out a way to be more, to be able to, acknowledge that and almost like appreciate it. And I feel like, in the Mongolian context, it's something that I've learned just from discussions with the livestock herds people and seeing how they, talk about what has happened in the past, talk about what's happening now, and also they're thinking about how to adapt in coming years.
The drilling was going on again. This issue of uncertainty, it even comes back when I was looking back at a couple of the forecasts from Monday, of what was coming. Someone said there was a moderate risk of extreme precipitation. What does that make you think?
It makes me think that
it's accurate. It was perfectly accurate.
It makes me think about who is the intended recipient of that. For some people, I think that makes a lot of sense. And maybe that might lead someone who lives, I don't know, a few hours north of the city, New York City, if they were going to come into the city that day, maybe that would change their mind. And okay, that's important for that person. Maybe if there was an event, a meeting to happen, maybe someone might rethink it. But how about the common New Yorker who's just going about their lives, who lives and works in Queens, for example? Is that really going to change the way is that really going to change their expectations for how that day will unfold? I mean, I think that's something that was surprising. The day of the flash floods, what could have been done differently? What should have been done differently from like a personal perspective? I would love to hear from someone that someone that's New York City based and lives in New York and works in New York. What did anybody modify like their daily set of activities because we had a flash flood watch or warning? And at what moment, at what time, like with what message did they justify saying, like, you know what, I'm not going to take the kids to the playground? Like,
right. No, that's a really important part of this. A lot of the discussion on Twitter is among meteorologists. Tomer Berg here, he's part of the WX Twitter community. But then that stuff gets picked up and spread around. We sort of have this weird landscape of communication now where what might be sort of expert to expert analysis gets sort of flamed out in ways that can get to audiences in a different way. And this relates to COVID-19 as much as climate. Seems to create an interesting challenge too.
Definitely. But in some ways it must be an opportunity, right, Andy? And I think your experience I enjoyed talking to you about just how things have changed over the past 10, 20 plus years. So maybe that's a question to you too. Like, if we focus specifically on communication of uncertainty, have you seen a change like over your career? And then I guess, like, what are the benefits or drawbacks of social media in terms of uncertainty, that specific element?
I think it's a mess right now. To me, social media, the whole communication environment is so new that that's created this weird landscape. Usually when a new communication system comes around, the exploitation for either for bad or for non-constructive use gets in the foreground really quickly. Remember, the VHS cassettes were first, it was the porn industry that really got things going. And then that became more of a normalized medium. And seems that virtually everything we create starts with a lot of noise. And I feel like we're still very much in that noisy phase. We were in a conversation earlier today with the UN disaster risk folks, and I think it was David Alexander.
Yes.
Said he came out with a paper 7 years ago on social media and disaster communication, and he said it got referenced 300 times a year or something like that, and he said it's totally out of date.
Yeah.
Because we're in an emergent landscape as well of media that are, so it's like, to me, what I feel needs to happen is some focus on the functional properties of the medium, making them a little bit more torquing things towards a better direction.
Yeah.
Or literacy, making sure, like Renee Hobbs at URI, who I've had on here before, she teaches a course in propaganda literacy. She has a whole curriculum in propaganda literacy online. And so we at least know what the messaging is that we're being buffeted with.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like early days. I don't think anyone has figured it out yet. I think, you can always find outliers who are doing great stuff. And
yeah,
the warming stripes. We did a show here on the warming stripes, temperature over time. This is one of these popular climate logos. And I had a behavioral scientist on here who said, we have no evidence this works. We don't even know. We don't know one way or the other what works yet. So that's my answer. It's turbulent. It's sort of like someone dropped a big boulder into a pool and it's still in the stage of flux.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I was surprised when I started to work more in like the disaster risk space, moving from meteorology. I thought there would be more guidance and more resources for people, for meteorologists to, just know how to be better communicators. And I guess I didn't think that the responsibility would really fall on me as much as it does and should. I now think it should. We do have a responsibility. But yeah, I just always felt that there were very different things. But I've also learned, and it's surprising, I've learned a lot from people working in like the design space and also even in like the visual art space about communicating risk. And someone else that I would like to shout out, and I don't know if I could post her link here, but working more with like cognitive scientists. There's someone who I work with. Her name is Dr. Lace Padilla. She's at UC Merced. She does a lot of work on understanding cognition and perception specific to disasters. If I put the link, where does it go, Andy? I see private chat and comments. Could I do my own comments?
You can share. If it's a website to share, you can hit share, or just send me, put it in the private chat and I can open it. Okay.
So this is her name. She does fantastic work. And she has her own lab called, here, I'll get the link for that. Spatial Perception, Applied Cognition and Education Lab. Okay, this is research though. I'm not saying that this work is going to say, but I think it's important to highlight people that I think are doing really good work in this space. And I learn a lot from, and also learn what I don't know. There's a lot that goes into how people perceive risk and what motivates people to act. And that's like what her work and her lab focuses on.
That's great. Yeah, I'm putting it in the comments right now so people can explore that. There's actually really good questions that have come in. So let me
good.
Go to a couple of those. Maurizio Moravito, who I've been getting to know for years on Facebook. Here he is on LinkedIn. He says, have you wondered if all the talk about future climate change in the year 2100 might have distracted from interventions that are needed today? Models and projections and mission controls may make the issue of vulnerability a matter of future people and not us.
I don't know. It says, hi, Andy. I'm guessing. I don't know which one he's talking to.
Well, I think it's for the conversation. I could offer my thoughts too, but we could say that the climate change focus has mainly been, I think most of the public discourse around climate change has been on mitigating emissions for the benefit of reducing future risk, more than mitigating real-time impacts.
Yes.
This through the adaptation debate. And here, this is written in I think this is a really interesting way of framing it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think yes. My answer is yes. I think so. And I think part of this goes back to comfort. I think dealing with climate change is uncomfortable, I think, for all of us, scientists as well. It's not a comfortable topic. And it's a privilege to even be able to be a scientist and someone that's working in like real world applications. And I think retaining some element of comfort is one of the reasons that scientists kind of focus more on the longer term. Now, I'm not saying that I think the shorter term is more uncomfortable, let's say, to engage in, with more uncertainty and also more accountability from a scientist perspective, to be right, or at least be appropriate in the types of information communicated. Now, I know that's not the best language to use, but I'm trying to look at this from a bigger picture perspective. Maybe part of it comes down to, well, if I make a statement for what might happen in 2100, I'm long gone before anybody could ever look at me when people try to see if that came true. Whereas working in disasters,
right, good point.
Yeah, it happens all the time. I think a lot about accountability and responsibility in communicating risk in shorter term timescales. It's really hard. And again, I think scientists should be accountable to some degree. I also think this is an argument for having more translators, and brokers in between. I mean, maybe that's a way to distribute that accountability. But these people should be trained as well. It's not just anybody could be an interpreter of science. It also needs to be someone who could understand what's going on in the community, who's trusted at the community level, and could also interpret actions and perceptions back to the scientists so that the result is a message that is more directly applicable to perhaps some actions that can be taken when we see a change in risk, when there's enough time to do that. So again, I think that's my answer is definitely thinking more about like data. I'm not saying that's the best answer from like an action perspective, but that is one way that I kind of react to your question, Maurizio. Thank you.
And let's see. Stephanie Hodge has a couple of thoughts here. Also from LinkedIn, the flash storm warning on iPhone did not hold any meaning.
Yeah.
Right. So you get the alert, you get the buzz. We went out for a walk precisely at the highest rainfall to check out on a cat trap in Long Island City. There were 3 emergency flash flood warnings, but we did not have any prior experience. So that's interesting. Maybe that gets to what we were saying earlier about developing countries where there's more experience. Or like with earthquakes, California has more experience, so people are more responsive to earthquake prep than in Oregon, where it's a rare.
Well, I just want to thank Stephanie for the anecdote there, and I'll tell a quick story myself related to that, and then come back to the answer. So, one of the moments where I decided to focus the majority of my research on floods, and specifically flash floods. Like we were at Columbia, we run a NASA-funded project looking at flash flood risk, and one of the reasons that motivated me to do it was there's a bus that goes from Columbia main campus to Columbia Lamont campus, which is like half an hour north of the city. And there's a shuttle bus that goes back, and it's all like climate scientists, people, broadly speaking, people studying climate from different perspectives, also other geophysical sciences. And we're on the bus about halfway, and it was kind of a cloudy day, but it wasn't like excessively stormy. And all of a sudden, everyone on the bus got a flash flood warning. And I remember sitting in the back, kind of seeing everybody, and I'm like, oh, this is my chance. I get to see how scientists react to flash flood warnings. Like, this is a flash flood warning. Like people should be able to perceive the risk. And I'm like, what would people do? It was super interesting to watch because most people either ignored it or kind of got upset that it was going off. And really, nothing happened. The bus driver didn't stop. No one kind of changed what they're doing. No one texted anybody. It was just like going back to what you were doing before you got that. And they make sense. I mean, I didn't do anything either. I mean, partially, I guess, what did I actually do? I looked on my phone and I was able to look at the local radar and see that whatever storm that is that would trigger that warning is actually going to miss the exact location of the bus. But still, people don't know what to do when you have these warnings. And what is the intention of these warnings anyways? I like the language that you use, Stephanie, when you talk about the emergency, because that's one of the answers that the National Weather Service came up with, because there has been increased awareness of this problem. People don't perceive the risk when they receive a flash flood warning. So we need another level. The flash flood emergency is so rare for the National Weather Service to issue that it was meant to say, well, you know what? We issue the flash flood warnings and people aren't really responding. We need a flash flood emergency level, and then people will respond to the term emergency. But I think that one of the challenges now is like, do people even understand that there's a difference between a flash flood warning and a flash flood emergency in terms of getting that alert on your phone? The scientists who designed those, there's a lot of work that goes into designing them. And to me, it makes sense. There's thresholds of risk that need to be passed in order to those warnings to be triggered. But again, I think that's a question we need to ask. Are those messages clear enough? And yeah, would your actions change when you get a flash flood warnings? Would your actions change if you got a flash flood emergency notice? And what would the difference be?
I mentioned California because I've written a lot about earthquake risk too, and they have shakeouts every year. Here's the Twitter. The Twitter feed is I think it's at Shakeout, and this is because there's enough low-level earthquake activity in California that it's sort of a normal thing to do. It's on people's minds. You kind of know the basic responses. And maybe maybe this is a point where a city like New York or Nashville or, clearly where you have this flash flood potential, Hsinchu in China, where there's your normalized preparedness just as much as we would for earthquakes in California.
Maybe.
Seems like there's some potential there.
Well, I think the challenge, another reason why my research has focused on flash flood is that I think they're very much a neglected hazard. I think when we look at coastal flood risk or riverine flood risk, it's like, okay, well, you need a coastline or you need a river in order to have some level of risk surrounding those entities. With flash floods, you technically could have a flash flood anywhere if enough rainfall occurred in a given period of time. So if you're talking about what areas, like you could identify which areas are not at risk of coastal floods. You could identify areas that are not at risk of riverine floods. It's a very tricky question to answer if you say which areas are not at risk. I'm talking no risk of flash floods. There's very few.
Right.
So what do you do? Now you have to develop a shakeout type program for flash floods for pretty much everyone in the US. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but that's much different than saying, oh, just the coastal areas. Still, the coastal areas are a big area, but it's not the whole country,
That's an interesting point. Here another LinkedIn comment. Amanda Grossi was in Manhattan, kind of echoing. She was saying what Stephanie said. The impacts in my area from Henri were much less than were warned. So when the warnings came for Ida, I did not heed them or take them seriously. This I've heard a lot from my friends who work on tornado risk, because tornado warnings can be successful, but 90% of the people who receive the tornado warning won't experience the tornado. So how do you train for a sort of, I guess that gets to the trust level or understanding that, this one didn't hit you, but thank you for heeding the warning anyway. I don't know.
I think Amanda, thanks Amanda for your question. I think I understand this, and I think it's completely logical to react in this way. I also think from a disaster management, emergency management perspective, we know this effect, and we've seen this many times, even in New York. Irene happened a year before Sandy, for example. People stated the reason why they stayed in Sandy was because they got the warning for Irene, they evacuated, and then nothing really happened in their opinion. So when Sandy came, I don't want to evacuate this time because of my experience last year. This is known. But we could do better. If we know there could be a widespread perception of a false alarm in a previous event, especially one that was only 2 weeks ago, then we could do better at confronting that and calling what it is. I'm not sure if any of the messaging said like, this is a different event. Like, we realize, maybe acknowledging in some ways that Henri was a miss or a false alarm in some context. Maybe that would have allowed people to, maybe that would have like built trust in some ways. I'm not sure. But we need to do better with that, definitely.
There's one more angle here that's worth bringing in, perhaps. Also, just on Wednesday, in the middle of all this, the World Meteorological Organization put out their 50-year review of disaster trends. And there's really good news on deaths overall. That as you know, in Bangladesh, for example, there's nothing that's happened in recent decades, even with very powerful storms, remotely like what happened in 1970. So we're on a path toward much lower much lower losses. Every death is a lamentable tragedy, especially those that were avoidable and those that were because of injustice or prejudice, pushing people into, zones of danger. But it feels there are people out there on the internet now making a database case that the world's actually doing great. And sometimes that can be a confusing layer of the discourse too. I don't know if you have your own sense of how to communicate around that. How do you maintain the urgency?
Yeah, I think that picture speaks for this, and I think that paints a picture of one of the primary flood types that we're doing better at addressing. So this looks like with the palm trees. I'm guessing this is a coastal area, and I'm guessing this is the unfortunate aftermath of a storm surge event or a tropical cyclone related event. And yes, we are definitely doing better at understanding the risks associated with tropical cyclone. I say risks because you have wind, you have heavy rain, and you have storm surge. We're doing better at that. We're doing better at forecasting them. Some of the work at Columbia University, actually, with Chai-Ying Lee and Kyle Manley, Adam Sobel's group, they're doing a really good job in forecasting storm surge with many other people in the world. Yeah, that's true. I fear that we have not allocated enough resources to look at flash floods, and especially flash floods in urban areas. And it makes sense. I mean, we have the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, which says when the atmosphere warms, it has an increased capacity to hold water. This is also known. And when we're going to have these heavier, intense bursts of rainfall, and this will cause a different type of flood, and it'll cause flooding in places that aren't familiar with floods, and it may cause floods. It may cause flash floods to happen in areas that were more familiar with other types of floods. So some of the work we're doing now is just advocating for a better disaggregation of flood type in the historical records and in the documentation process moving forward. So we could say, okay, great, we're doing really well at storm surge flooding, but actually the trend for flash floods may be much different. And I do think that's the case in some areas.
So this is an emergent and distinctive area of risk that needs a lot more work, it sounds like.
Yes, it needs to be prioritized. And especially if we're talking about urban areas, we must include the social justice element as well. When we have such tight gradients, of economic conditions and demographics in cities, like this is also something that we've seen here in New York with this latest storm, once again. So, I mean, it's always important when we're talking about disasters, but especially if we're talking about disasters in urban areas.
For sure. Well, this is I think we'll wrap up shortly because there's much to do here. And there's a lot for you to do, I know, both in just tending to life and getting your work done. I wanted to end with a really interesting video that was online. It was a young meteorologist who's running around in the city. Let me just see if I want to set this up correctly so we can hear him. Stop screen, share screen. This will just take 1 second. Here he is, and I'll show his website so people can follow up.
That car started floating. No. This is what climate change looks like, guys. This is what climate change does. This is why we shouldn't be freaking polluting this atmosphere. This is what climate change looks like, guys. This is what climate change looks like. See all that flooding water from all that torrential rain? That's what climate change does. We have cars started floating. That car started floating. Yeah, this is bad. This is really bad. This is severe flooding. This is crazy. And we got like 70-mile-an-hour winds. Yeah, like 60-mile-an-hour winds coming through.
Pretty wild. So that's Hurricane
And
Central.
this area doesn't normally ever flood either. You see the car now?
And there he's kind of making the point you just made that, this is a new terrain. So again, there's work to be done.
Well, do I have time to make one more comment?
Yeah, of course.
Actually, I'll make two more comments. First, I think it's important to say this as someone who looks at this very much from a scientific perspective. It's really important for us to remember that these are events. Oops.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
No, but these are events that real people, so the stories coming out of the event are so heartbreaking, and it's it's to see that our New York City neighbors, people live so close, to see the level of impact on their lives and livelihoods, we need to do better. And it affects the way. It's hard sometimes because it's part of my work. It's part of my work, but also it's hard to process the emotional element of it. And in some ways you got to focus, but in other ways it's actually, I think, important to remember that these are events that are impacting people, and they're impacting more and more people as we move on. But yeah, the last point I want to say is I think this is important too. So I think, so we had Sandy a few years ago, and that led to, I think, some good things. Some things happened. There was convening of different groups and some policies that developed. And should we have been more proactive to say, okay, well, we did this for Sandy. We did this for storm surge flooding. What are some other hazards that maybe we want to be proactive so we don't need an event where 50 people die, 100 people die for us to wake up? Should we have done that for flash floods? I think we should have, but we didn't. So now we're faced with an opportunity, I think a responsibility to do so. Thinking ahead, what are some other hazards that we as a community, as an interdisciplinary disasters community around science, policy, and practice, what are the other hazards that we have the responsibility to be proactive and think about? And the one that comes to mind that actually scares me is extreme heat. Do we need to have a mass casualty event from extreme heat within New York City for us to wake up and be more proactive? And I say mass casualty because we're already having people dying from heat waves in New York. Must we have a highly publicized mass casualty event from heat waves for us to start thinking about it? And I really hope we could do something before we're faced with a similar situation where many people died and at least there's more political will to make a change. So that's something I've been thinking a lot about today. And I hope we're able to push for those discussions at least.
I think that's really important. And we did a session on here not long ago about that with Christy Ebby, who's at University of Washington. She was coming to the show from the heat dome in Seattle, and she said, no one needs to die in a heat wave. And it's largely because of what you just said, knowing where people are more exposed and designing cities and policies going forward to limit risk where the risk is greatest is really an important part of where we go from here. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, for being with us today. And the drilling is started again. Good timing. Have a good weekend. And let's talk more about this. We'll do more sessions on heat, on how we move forward with communication on all these issues. Thanks again.
Yes, thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody. Have a nice weekend.
And great questions. Yeah, for sure. Take care.